Hello again, on this, the last of the 5 Lenten talks on the Psalms. I want to try and do 2 things in this final talk. First of all, to look at Psalm 87, the Friday night psalm prayer, and the last of the 10 that we'll have looked at in these 5 weeks. And then just to offer a kind of conclusion, a reflection on what I've learned or been struck by in presenting these. So, Psalm 87 or 88, a confession. It's one of my least favourite psalms of night prayer. For some reason, Sunday and this psalm I don't particularly, or haven't particularly warmed to. So when I found that I'd organised it in such a way that this psalm would be the only psalm we'd look at today, I thought, oh gosh, that's not very well done, is it? And yet, once I had really begun to examine it and read up about it, I find it absolutely fascinating. A little anecdote how just after we had started offering the Compline 3 nights a week back in mid-January, one of the members of our PEP team, our Parish Emergency Planning team, said that they'd found it incredibly gloomy and they'd wanted their spirits raised, and this did the opposite. I hadn't felt that particularly about the Psalms of night prayer, but I realised later that that person must have tuned in on a Friday night with this psalm. And the commentaries on it certainly don't pull any punches. One says that the Psalms are not only for sunny days and sunny personalities, and that no other psalm of the 150 and the Psalter, as it's called, can compete with this one for unrelenting gloom. Another person described it as the most desolate of all the psalms. And that many phrases contain classical descriptions of depression, and that it's even an embarrassment to convention or faith. It's certainly in the genre described as a lament. And in this particular lament, there's no clear indication of having any reason for hope. Looking at it, and I hope that you've found it on the final page of the hard copy of the newsletter, or page 8 if you've got it online, because it's much easier to follow what I'm saying if you have it in front of you. There are really 3 sections in this prayer, each of which is introduced by an address to the Lord. Right at the beginning, Lord my God, I call for your help by day. And then is it verse 9, I call to you, Lord, all the day long. And verse 13, as for me, Lord, I call to you for help. And the central part of this psalm is verses 9 to 12, which have been described as very audacious. 6 rhetorical questions. Will you work your wonders for the dead? Will the shades stand and praise you? Will your love be told in the grave, or your faithfulness among the dead? Will your wonders be known in the dark, or your justice in the land of oblivion? The psalmist crying out, sort of berating God, challenging God. And remember, there's no real belief in the afterlife at the time the psalm is written. The idea is that once you die, you go to this rather dead place called Sheol, where you live a kind of half existence. And the imagery again is very stark. A military society. I have reached the end of my strength, like one alone among the dead, like the slain lying in their graves. I suppose down through history with all the wars and battles, you have contact, many people have had contact with the slain lying in their graves, something that most of us are preserved from. And it ends starkly again. My one companion is darkness. No sign of hope. But what really struck me was what people said about it, and one commentator felt they had to answer what this was doing in the Bible. This is the embarrassment to conventional faith. And the response, well, life is like that. And these poems continue to speak about all of life and not just the good points or the good parts. It can also be viewed as, is Israel dealing with Yahweh and Yahweh's silence? The history of the chosen people in the Old Testament was again a very stark one, living as they did on a fertile strip between empires. And even if you transport it to the modern day, this is a kind of perfect psalm for those living through the Holocaust. And there's an idea that even amidst the unrelenting gloom, this psalm gives hope because it expresses the tenuous link between the psalmist and the Lord of life. And the psalmist, the person praying, tries to be faithful in the course of complete abandonment, feeling totally abandoned by God, and yet continuing to pray to God. Again, the idea that these words are not ones to be used frequently, but should just be used for what you might call limit experiences, those extreme experiences that come to us or come to a few people at different times. And it's been suggested that this psalm has an important place in the book of Psalms as a whole, and that illustrates that unanswered prayer doesn't destroy the faith relationship. It keeps on persevering. And the psalmist, like Job in the book of Job, continues to cry for help by day and night, even despite the sense of being totally abandoned by God. And like, I think, was it Psalm 142, one of the earlier ones that we've dealt with, the idea that people can pray this psalm on behalf of those who have to face the black dog of depression, who have to face the deep and extreme pain of bereavement, or, say, of terminal illness. We can pray it on behalf of our fellow human beings who are suffering most. And also the idea that Jesus himself, in his passion, experienced something of the darkness and despair, and he eventually came through to the resurrection. And the idea is that we are also encouraged to persevere, and that eventually light will break through the darkness even if there's no sign of it. So, for me, a fascinating psalm, and one that in a sense doesn't fit into ordinary prayer books, you might say, but is part of our heritage. And because so many people down through the centuries have lived in extreme situations of pain and bereavement and anxiety, and have felt abandoned by God, this is their prayer, just as it was perhaps the prayer of Jesus. So, to conclude, a reminder that the idea of this series of talks on the Psalm came out of, again, a PEP meeting, when our weekly group meeting to look at how we help people live through lockdown. The idea of Compline and night prayer, and yet that the Psalms were quite foreign to many people. So this tied in with the fact that I'd always thought, well, I really should read up about the Psalms a bit. I've been praying them for so long. I've always wanted to, never got round to it. And that it was a good idea to offer something different in Lent. Hence these 5 talks. And the surprises that have come with them. How little, just as I've failed really to study them since I was in seminary, 35 years ago or more, how little teaching there is about them, and people feeling that they've really been left in the dark. Okay, there's a psalm at every Mass, but it's hardly ever spoken about. And along with that, I'm really struck by how much a little reading or background being offered transforms them and helps them to come alive, it seems, for quite a lot of people. What else have I learned? How Jesus and the Psalms are so closely linked. They were almost certainly his prayers that he knew by heart, part of his identity and culture. I loved the idea, which we had early on, of Jesus praying the Psalms as a young lad, going with his family and the extended family from Nazareth to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, and those final Psalms of Ascent, that 118 to 133, I think, these noisy groups of pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem and meeting up with each other on the path up to Jerusalem, and Jesus among them praying the Psalms together. And we know from St. Matthew that at the Last Supper, before they went to Gethsemane, Jesus and the apostles prayed the Psalms of Passover together. And they seem to have been on his lips when he died. At least Matthew and Mark place Psalm 21, my God, why have you forsaken me?" the opening lines, whereas in Luke's Gospel, Jesus says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." Again, that's the psalm from, I think it's Wednesday's night prayer. Yes, well, or was it Tuesday? Well, one of them at least. And not just Jesus. That the early Christians, the early church, they, in seeking to understand Jesus' life, they interpreted it often in the light of the Psalms or certain Psalms. So, Jesus' cleansing of the temple, which we heard was at the 3rd Sunday Gospel of this year, the evangelist interprets that in the light of Psalm 69 verse 10, "Zeal for your house will devour me." And that both Peter at Pentecost and Paul on his trip in the first missionary journey in Asia Minor when they're preaching, they interpret the resurrection according to the book of Acts through the phrase in Psalm 15. That's Thursday's night prayer. For you will not leave my soul among the dead. As if there was this expectation of resurrection. So Jesus prayed them, and his predecessors prayed them, and Mary and Joseph prayed them, and the early Christians prayed them, and they've continued to be prayed down through the centuries. I went to a school run by Benedictine monks, Ampleforth in Yorkshire, where the monks were faithful to singing the Psalms 5 times a day. So it's part of my own kind of journey of faith. Not particularly warming to them at the time, although one or two, particularly the Psalms of Compline, made quite a deep emotional impact. But there's this continuity for 2,500 years of faithful believers praying the Psalms. And they sanctify them by doing that. They're part of our cultural inheritance and our religious inheritance. And they show us, if we ever need reminding, of our links with our brothers and sisters of the Jewish race and the Jewish faith. And it's been well said, there's a psalm for any mood you might have, from despair to joy. Psalm 150, praise God in the holy places. That's a psalm of great praise. Compare that with this psalm of Friday night prayer, Psalm 87, for people in despair. And perhaps finally, partly because I have been praying them for so long, but also because of their intrinsic power and beauty, I find myself praying different phrases or sentences from the psalm at different times in the day. So often beginning prayer, in the morning let me know your love. I'm praying at night prayer, into your hands I commend my spirit, at the end of each day. Or Thursday night, you will show me the path of life, the fullness of joy in your presence, at your right hand happiness forever. Or guide my heart to fear your name. Make me know the way I should walk. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to find words to express one's feelings or to address our God, and the Psalms are a tremendous help, I find, for that. And we've looked at 10 Psalms in the last 5 weeks. There are 150 of them, so there are 140 more to explore. And as so often with Scripture, each time we come to them, we're a different person, so they can be afresh or fresher each time. So, good luck in the next 140. Thanks, and goodbye.